The story began in the most ordinary way possible, with a single garden gnome. I had placed it in my front yard, nestled among the flower beds that I'd carefully cultivated for years. To me, it was a harmless, even whimsical touchsome thing that gave personality to the otherwise cookie-cutter houses in the neighborhood. Its painted red hat stood out against the green shrubs, its mischievous smile a small reminder that home should feel alive. But in neighborhoods ruled by HOAs, even the smallest expression of individuality can be treated like a crime. A week after placing the gnome, I received the letter, cold, formal, and stamped with the HOAS insignia. It declared that I had violated aesthetic uniformity standards and was being fined $500. The amount stunned me. $500 for a decoration that cost me less than $20. At first, I laughed. Surely this was a mistake, or at least an overreaction. I thought I could reason with them, explain that the gnome was harmless. But when I attended the next HOA meeting, I realized it wasn't about the gnome at all. It was about power. At the center of the table sat the HOA president, a stern-faced woman with an icy demeanor, who seemed to relish the chance to humiliate me. She read out my infraction as if I had vandalized the neighborhood, sneering at the thought of a yard that dared to show personality. The meeting wasn't a discussion, it was a performance. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding eye contact, too afraid to speak up. Some gave me sympathetic looks, but no one challenged the board. The fine stood, and I was warned that if I didn't comply, additional penalties would follow. That night, I returned home seething. The gnome sat in the yard, untouched, smiling up at me as if mocking the absurdity of it all. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about principle, about the fact that people who had no stake in my life believed they could control every blade of grass, every detail of my property. I knew then that this was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the letters kept coming. Warnings about potential liens, threats of further fines, even suggestions that the gnome lowered property values. The board seemed determined to break me. But instead of cave-in, I started planning. The first step was understanding the system. I combed through the HOA bylaws, digging into the fine print most people never bothered to read. What I found was a labyrinth of vague rules, many of them outdated, and some that contradicted each other entirely. The board had been wielding them like weapons, selectively enforcing rules when it suited their agenda. My gnome was just their latest excuse. As the first pieced things together, I began to see cracks in their fortress of authority. They had overstepped, not just with me, but with countless neighbors who had quietly paid fines out of fear. My situation wasn't unique, it was part of a pattern. And if I was willing to fight, I might not only save my gnome, but also expose the hypocrisy at the heart of their rule. Still, there was a risk. Retaliation was almost certain. The HOA thrived on intimidation, and I had already become a target. But every time I considered backing down, I looked at that gnome. It wasn't just a decoration anymore, it was a symbol. A reminder that bullies only win if you let them. So I made a decision. I would not pay their fine. I would not remove the gnome. And I would not let them dictate how I lived in my own home. Instead, I would prepare my counter. What began as a petty squabble over yard decor was about to escalate into a full-blown war with the one that would shake the neighborhood to its core. The gnome, sitting quietly among the flowers, had no idea the storm it had started. But I knew, and I was ready. Refusing to pay the $500 fine was like lighting a fuse. Almost immediately, the HOA escalated its tactics. I received daily reminders in the mail, each more threatening than the last. Warning of interest charges, liens on my home, and even legal action. The president of the board made a show of passing my house during her evening walks, slowing down just long enough to glare at the gnome as though it were a public menace. But instead of feeling intimidated, I grew sharper, more focused. Their aggression confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't about community harmony. It was about control, and people who rule through control always leave traces of their mistakes behind. I began my research in earnest. At night, I combed through the HOA's financial records, which were publicly available but rarely requested. It didn't take long before patterns emerged. There were odd expenses listed under administrative fees, vague line items with suspiciously large numbers, landscaping contracts awarded to companies owned by relatives of board members, funds missing with no clear explanation. HOAs HOAs in T, just overstepping with petty fines. They were siphoning money from the very neighbors they claimed to represent. Armed with this knowledge, I realized I couldn't fight alone. The board thrived because everyone else felt isolated, convinced they had no power. If I wanted to bring them down, I needed allies. So I started quietly talking to neighbors, not in large groups where fear would silence them, but one-on-one, in driveways, at mailboxes, during casual conversations. The stories poured out. One man had been fined for having his trash can visible for 30 minutes past pickup. Another had been threatened with foreclosure over a missed $50 payment. A young family admitted they had paid over $1,000 in fines for unauthorized holiday decorations. Each story added fuel to the fire I was building. Slowly, whispers turned into anger. Neighbors who had been too scared to act realized they weren't alone. The Gnome became a kind of rallying point. What had started as a ridiculous fine against me became a symbol of every injustice the HOA had inflicted on the neighborhood. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Every letter, every notice, every petty rule they tried to enforce. I filed public records requests and collected receipts. Piece by piece, I built a case strong enough to hold up to scrutiny. The board, however, sensed resistance growing. Their retaliation became more desperate. One morning, I found a violation notice taped to my door, claiming my grass was half an inch too tall. Another accused me of unauthorized yard modifications because I had added mulch. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. Their strategy was clear. Drown me in so many infractions that I'd either break or give in. But instead of breaking, I dug deeper. The more they pushed, the more determined I became to expose them. The turning point came when a neighbor slipped me a copy of an email thread between board members. It detailed plans to make an example out of me so no one else would dare to resist. The HOA president's words were cold and unmistakable. She saw me not as a neighbor, but as an enemy to crush. That was the moment my fight became more than personal. It wasn't about the Gnome anymore. It was about justice. About showing everyone that the HOA was on Untuk, and about ensuring that no one else would have to live under their reign of fear. I knew what had to come next. With evidence in hand and a community beginning to rally, it was time to stop playing defense. It was time to go on the offensive. The board had declared war, and I was ready to fight back. Once the evidence was compiled and the outrage began to bubble, the next step was to turn private grumbling into public action. The HOA had built its power on silence and isolation. Its bylaws were a sword that gleamed only so long as neighbors were too timid to ask who held the blade. Breaking that silence became the strategy. The Gnome, which had once been a small, harmless ornament, had now become the rallying symbol for a community that had been pushed too far. The first organized move was quiet and tactical. Flyers were not posted in the dead of night, nor were confrontations staged on the front lawn. Instead, one-on-one conversations multiplied until a network existed. People swapped stories at mailboxes, compared fines over morning coffee, and left anonymous notes on kitchen tables. The fear that had kept people compliant for years began to soften under the steady pressure of shared experience. What had been isolated grievances formed a pattern that revealed the HOA's behavior was not the exception but the rule. With the network in place, coordination followed. A private online group was formed for neighbors who wanted to stay informed without antagonizing the board in public. Through that channel, the evidence I had gathered was distributed: financial irregularities, unexplained administrative fees, and the email thread that exposed a vow to make an example. Screenshots and copies of violation letters circulated, sparking a new emotion across the neighborhood: righteous anger. The next move was strategic and symbolic. The Gnome remained in the yard, untouched and resolute. Surrounding it, other neighbors began placing small, tasteful, decorative items: garden flags, solar lanterns, whimsical stones. Each one a quiet act of solidarity. The collective display was subtle enough to avoid immediate reprisal, but visible enough to show that what happened to one could happen to many. It was an unspoken message. The Gnome was not alone. Legal pressure became a parallel front. An attorney was consulted to examine the dubious fines and the board's selective enforcement practices. The attorney's response validated what we'd suspected. The HOA had overreached. Many of the punitive actions lacked legal foundations. The knowledge that legal counsel existed shifted the balance of fear. It did not eliminate risk, but it made retaliation costlier and exposed the board to scrutiny they could not control. Public accountability was the next lever. The neighborhood newsletter, usually a passive list of rules and upcoming installations, was transformed into a platform for transparency. Residents requested copies of minutes from past meetings, budgets, and contractor invoices. Requests that the board would have previously buried in bureaucratic delays were followed relentlessly. The more documents revealed, the more patterns emerged. Contracts awarded without bids, expenses with vague descriptions, and reimbursements that coincided suspiciously with board members' personal purchases. Each line item was a thread. Pulling at a few threads unraveled more. The power of optics played a role. A small documentary-style video was compiled using clips neighbors had captured on their phones, images of violation notices. Taped 2 doors. The Gnome framed against a backdrop of fines. Interviews filmed only as voiceovers, explaining injustices. The video did not attack people. It presented facts. It was concise, shareable, and emotionally resonant. It spread quietly at first, then more widely, landing in group chats and inbox. When it reached a local community blog, the story leaped beyond the cul-de-sac and onto a broader audience. Now, the HOAs actions were not just neighborhood gossip. They were public record. That publicity changed the dynamic inside the HOA meetings. No longer could the board safely convene behind closed doors and expect unanimous compliance. Meetings swelled with neighbors who had previously stayed away. The room that once filled with nods and silent acquiescence now echoed with the rustle of petitions and the murmur of questions. The board found itself on the defensive, stumbling through explanations as residents pointed to invoices, receipts, and the attorney's notes. The Gnome, small and defiant on the curb, had become the hinge of a larger civic awakening. Coordination escalated to concrete action. A formal petition demanding an independent audit of the HOA's finances and a special meeting to address the issue of selective enforcement. The petition gathered signatures faster than any of us expected. People who had been silent for years signed, not out of malice, but out of a desire to reassert normalcy and fairness. Signatures came from homeowners association members who had previously paid fines without protest. The sheer number of signatures made the petition impossible to ignore. At the same time, small acts of organized resistance began to point to wider unrest. A neighborhood yard sale transformed into an impromptu meeting where questions were asked publicly for the first time. A block party, once canceled under HOA threat, was rescheduled en masse. The turnout was a visible demonstration that the community had chosen enjoyment over fear. Children ran through sprinklers, neighbors barbecued, and the sight of families enjoying their property struck a chord. The HOAS rules had been about control, not community stewardship. The board attempted to respond with threats and additional fines, but those moves became Each new letter was met with a public posting of the correspondence, followed by explanations analytically dismantling the board's claims. When the HOA tried to narrow the scope of the petition by questioning the validity of signatures, neighbors responded with notarized statements and evidence that made the board's counterclaims crumble. As preparations for the special meeting took shape, momentum shifted irreversibly. The Gnome, the original pretext for this conflict, remained planted in its bed, a small red hat peeking between marigolds and mint. It was no longer a novelty. It was a symbol of community resistance. The board's authority, once assumed and absolute, now stood publicly contested. The final piece of the plan before the special meeting was legal and political. The simultaneous filing of a formal complaint with the state agency that oversees homeowners associations and a civil demand for an audit. Together they applied both regulatory pressure and the threat of legal consequences. The dual approach ensured that whatever the board did at the meeting, outside forces would also be watching. When the day of the special meeting arrived, the turnout exceeded expectation. People filed into the room with copies of documents in hand and determination in their faces. The Gnome's small statue had inspired something much larger, coordinated. Lawful movement to reclaim an association that had drifted from public service into private gain. The board shuffled papers and attempted to reassert control, but the script had been flipped. Questions were asked, facts were laid bare, and the neighbors who had once felt powerless discovered that the power had always been theirs to wield. At the end of that meeting, the board's veneer was long gone. Promises that once sounded authoritative now rang hollow. The Gnome, small but steadfast, had sparked a revolution built on paperwork, solidarity, and smart strategy. The fight was no longer one person's crusade against petty authority. It had become a community reclaiming its voice. The special meeting had cracked the board's armor, but cracks were not enough. What came next was escalation calculated, deliberate, and devastating for those who had hidden behind the HOA's authority for far too long. In the weeks following the meeting, the board's desperation grew palpable. Where they once wielded fines with smug confidence, they now scrambled to justify each one. Violation notices became more frequent, absurd in their reach, and targeted almost exclusively at the households most vocal in opposition. Grass half an inch too high, flower beds too wide, fences too colorful. The board flung accusations like darts, hoping one might stick. But the strategy backfired. Each notice was logged, photocopied, and shared publicly. Neighbors began compiling a thick dossier of harassment, fines, which painted the board not as protectors of the neighborhood but as aggressors lashing out against dissent. The more they wrote, the more evidence they left behind. The pressure they had once used to isolate individuals now worked against them. Instead of fearing retaliation, homeowners grew bolder. Conversations that once whispered in private now happened openly on sidewalks and porches. The Gnome, steadfast in my yard, had become a pilgrimage spot of sorts. Neighbors would stop to take photos. Children pointed to it with grins, and it appeared in social media posts as the unofficial emblem of our fight. Meanwhile, the attorney's involvement deepened. With each new violation, legal letters were sent back to the HOA, not with apologies, but with demands for justification. The board, unaccustomed to resistance, stumbled. Their responses contradicted one another, exposing inconsistencies in how rules were applied. In some cases, their bylaw citations didn't even exist in the actual governing documents. What they had passed off for years as law turned out to be nothing more than bluff. The financial audit, once dismissed as an idle threat, was officially underway. An independent firm began pouring through the HOS books, and what they uncovered was damning. Inflated invoices, payments to companies with direct ties to board members, and thousands of dollars in miscellaneous expenses that could not be explained. The whispers of corruption hardened into documented proof. When those findings began circulating, the narrative shifted entirely. This was no longer about a $500 Gnome finite. Was about theft, mismanagement, and betrayal. The board that had postured as guardians of property values were exposed as opportunists enriching themselves at the community's expense. The exposure drew outside attention. Local media picked up the story after a community blog broke the details of the audit. Headlines painted the neighborhood as the battleground of HOA abuse and homeowner resistance. Reporters came with cameras, capturing footage of the Gnome, of meetings where residents stood defiantly against the board, of neighbors speaking about years of intimidation. The HOA president, once feared, now found herself cornered by questions she couldn't answer on record. The humiliation was unbearable for her. Yet instead of stepping down gracefully, she doubled down, insisting the board's actions were lawful and the resistance was nothing more than troublemakers disrupting order. But the facade had already collapsed. With every defensive statement, she only amplified the narrative of arrogance and corruption. Retaliation, however, did not cease. My mailbox was vandalized. Small acts of intimidation followed me at night, and anonymous letters appeared in my yard warning me to let it go. But fear no longer worked. Every act of retaliation was catalogued, photographed, and shared. What was meant to scare me instead fueled the story, further discrediting the very people trying to silence opposition. The revenge I had envisioned wasn't about anger or chaos. It was about exposure dragging what had thrived in the shadows into the light where it could no longer survive. And with each passing week, the board's grip weakened. The final act of escalation came when the state agency responsible for overseeing homeowners associations announced a formal investigation. Complaints had poured in, not just from our neighborhood, but from others, where the same president and her allies had served before. The Gnome had sparked something larger than a local dispute. It had pulled the thread on a tapestry of corruption that stretched beyond our cul-de-sac. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the dynamic was unrecognizable. The board sat hunched, defensive, while homeowners filled the room armed with documents, news, clippings, and legal representation. The questions came fast, the demands louder, and the authority that once silenced dissent was gone. For the first time, the board looked fragile, vulnerable. I sat in the back of the room, watching the spectacle unfold, knowing we were only steps away from their collapse. The gnome still stood proudly in my yard, its red hat visible to anyone who passed. But now it represented more than resistance. It represented victory and progress. The board had fined me $500 to make an example. Instead, they had created their own downfall, and I wasn't finished yet. The unraveling of the HOA was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, methodical collapse, like a building stripped beam by beam until the entire structure could no longer stand. What began as whispers of corruption had become documented proof, and once that proof circulated through the neighborhood, there was no going back. Board members who had once spoken with rehearsed confidence now struggled to defend themselves. Their public statements contradicted the very records revealed by the audit. At first, they tried to close meetings, citing security concerns. But homeowners demanded transparency, and the presence of local media ensured there would be no more secrecy. The spotlight they had once controlled now burned them from every angle. The president, the face of our torment, remained the loudest voice. She insisted everything was above board, that the audit was flawed, and that the resistance was nothing more than an orchestrated smear campaign. But even her allies grew restless. They could stomach confrontation, but they could not stomach the risk of personal liability. When lawyers began suggesting that individuals on the board could be held responsible for misused funds, the first cracks appeared in their unity. One by one, members began to distance themselves from the president. Some resigned quietly, slipping away with vague letters citing personal reasons. Others, under pressure, flipped openly, turning over private emails and records that confirmed what many had long suspected, that the fines and violations were tools of control, selectively enforced to punish dissent and shield allies. The president's circle shrank, and her temper grew shorter. Where once she commanded the boardroom, she now lashed out desperately, cutting off speakers, banging gavels, and accusing neighbors of lies. Every outburst was caught on camera and shared widely, each video fueling the narrative of a leader unraveling under pressure. Meanwhile, the state investigation deepened. Officials arrived quietly at first, requesting documents and interviewing homeowners, but their presence was unmistakable. Clipboards and badges at HOA offices made the reality undeniable. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was a legal reckoning. The gnome, once just a whimsical figure in my garden, now stood as the community's unofficial mascot of defiance. Neighbors placed their own gnomes in yards, small armies of ceramic sentinels standing guard over lawns. Some painted theirs with slogans: "Not illegal, HOA free," and $500 icon. What had started as my personal rebellion had grown into a movement no one could ignore. As the tide turned, I planned the final strike. It wasn't enough to see the board crumble. What mattered was ensuring they could never rise again. Too many HOAs across the country had seen abusive boards replaced only to cycle back into the same patterns of power and control. If revenge was to be meaningful, it had to create permanence. With the help of neighbors, I drafted a petition for a full board recall and new elections. We didn't stop there. We included proposed bylaw amendments that limited board powers, increased financial transparency, and required majority approval for future fines. It wasn't just about ousting them, it was about stripping away the very tools they had abused. When the petition circulated, signatures poured in. People who had once stayed silent now eagerly added their names. The fear of retaliation had vanished, replaced by righteous determination. Each signature represented another nail in the coffin of the old regime. The president tried one last counterattack. She circulated letters, warning homeowners of dire consequences. If the recall succeeded, she threatened lawsuits, foreclosure actions, even intent at outside enforcement. But the threats had lost their power. Once, those letters would have terrified people. Now, they were laughed at, shared online as proof of desperation. And then came the meeting that marked the true collapse. The room was packed, standing room only, with neighbors, reporters, and state officials present. The petition was delivered in full view, thick with signatures. The president tried to gavel it down, tried to silence the room, but the noise drowned her out. Neighbors shouted her own words back at her, reminding her of every arrogant dismissal, every absurd fine, every threat. She stormed out mid-meeting, her face red with fury, trailed by the last of her dwindling allies. Cameras followed her to the parking lot, catching the image of a once dominant figure fleeing from the very people she had ruled. It was a moment of poetic justice, a queen abandoning her crumbling castle. After that night, the board effectively ceased to function. Resignations piled in, and the state confirmed active charges of financial mismanagement. Lawyers circled like vultures, preparing civil suits. The community prepared for elections, but more importantly, prepared for freedom. My gnome still stood in my yard, untouched, unmovable. Its small grin seemed wider now, as though it had known all along what would unfold. I often caught neighbors slowing down to glance at it, sometimes snapping a photo, sometimes just nodding in acknowledgement. It had transcended being an ornament. It was now a monument. The board had fined me $500 to prove their power. Instead, they had destroyed themselves, one desperate act at a time. And while the collapse was nearly complete, I knew one final chapter remained. The reckoning had to be sealed not just with resignations, but with accountability, with change so deep it could not be undone. And I was ready to deliver it. The downfall of the HOA had already begun, but what followed turned it from a collapse into a reckoning. For years, the board had operated unchecked, hiding behind rules, fines, and threats. But now, with the state involved, the media watching, and the neighborhood united, there would be no escape. The state's investigation moved quickly once the records were in hand. Auditors uncovered financial irregularities that went far beyond the petty fines levied against homeowners. Funds collected for community improvements had been siphoned into private accounts. Maintenance contracts were awarded to companies owned by relatives of board members. Even petty purchase lavish dinners, electronics, luxury furniture were linked back to HOA credit cards. The president, who had once stood proudly in her front yard dictating the color of mailboxes and the length of grass, now found herself facing something far greater than a frustrated neighbor. She faced subpoenas, legal summons, and the looming threat of criminal charges. Her carefully crafted image of authority crumbled under the weight of evidence. She was no longer the untouchable ruler of the neighborhood. She was a defendant in the making. The community, once silenced by fear, now thrived in open defiance. Gnomes multiplied across the neighborhood, lined up on porches, stationed at driveways, and planted firmly in front yards. Some homeowners even staged displays of dozens of gnomes together, creating whimsical armies that symbolized unity against tyranny. What began as a single $500 fine had transformed into a neighborhood-wide symbol of rebellion. But symbolism alone wasn't enough. True revenge required permanence. That's why the recall petition wasn't just a formality. It was the final nail in the coffin. When the special election day arrived, turnout shattered records. Neighbors who had never attended a meeting before stood in line to cast their votes. The results weren't even close. The old board was swept away entirely, replaced by new members committed to reform. And these time reforms came fast. Transparency measures were voted in. A cap on fines was established. Mandatory homeowner approval for major expenditures became law. Financial audits were scheduled annually, open to all. The stranglehold that had once dictated every detail of our lives was gone, replaced by accountability and fairness. The system had been rebuilt not to serve rulers, but to serve residents. The president did not go quietly. She fought, filed lawsuits, and ranted to anyone who would listen. But the lawsuits failed, each one dismissed as baseless. When the state formally charged her with financial misconduct, she disappeared from public view altogether. Rumors spread. Some said she sold her house under pressure, others that she left town entirely. What mattered most was that she was gone, and with her, the fear that had plagued the neighborhood. Looking back, the irony was impossible to ignore. The battle had started over a garden gnome, a harmless ornament meant to bring a smile to my yard. The board had chosen it as their hill to die on, believing that crushing one homeowner with a $500 fine would reaffirm their dominance. Instead, it triggered their downfall. The gnome had become the spark that lit the fire of resistance. Neighbors would often stop me on walks, laughing about how it all began. Some still joked about my revolutionary gnome, while others admitted that they had been too afraid to resist until they saw someone stand up. That, perhaps, was the sweetest victory of all. Not just my personal vindication, but the empowerment of an entire community. The gnome still stood where it always had, unchanged by the chaos it inspired. Its small, unassuming smile seemed to hold a secret, as though it knew what it had accomplished, and I let it stay not just as decoration, but as a reminder that power unchecked always leads to abuse, a reminder that silence allows tyranny to thrive, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can topple the mightiest oppressor. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about destroying them with anger. It was about outlasting them with truth, unity, and persistence. The board wanted me to bend, to obey, to accept their authority without question. But by standing firm, by refusing to yield over something as absurd as a garden gnome, I had turned their own arrogance against them. The HOA had fined me $500 to make an example of me. Instead, they became the story of how greed, corruption, and pettiness can unravel an empire when faced with the determination of a single neighbor who refuses to back down. And so, life returned to normal, yards filled with laughter instead of fear. Meetings became discussions, not battles. The neighborhood thrived not under the shadow of control, but in the light of freedom. And every time I passed that little gnome in my garden, I couldn't help but smile, because in the end, they tried to bury me under fines and threats, but instead, they buried themselves. And all it took was a gnome.